You know how it is. Lily, I'm gonna need a pen.
Or are you two gonna call
No.
It'll be like a mix. Like if you see someone, just bring them the mic, and like we'll kind of like. Which sentence should I cut? This one or the next one? This one or that one?
He had something else tonight. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, he's wonderful. That would have been great, but just you tonight.
Are we okay with opening the doors now?
I think we should. Hi, Dean Faraday. Dean Faraday. We actually have. Hi, how are you? I'm Lily. Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Both of you have your phones. Selfies like on your phone. Yeah. And actually, there's four seats over there.
Yes, I am. So nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, so just right in the front over there. I'm like hungry, but I...
Do you need food?
No, I don't want any. Okay, yeah, honestly, because like we need a...
Each person influenced to the good. I absolutely. That's going to be
wanted to make sure.
So what's happening?
She's right there. On the.
Oh, I see. But yeah, so I think like it's tough for me to come up with myself.
Yeah. Is it like empty? So aspirational.
I mean, what makes it?
Yeah, this is the best.
It's a very. It's a.
We could pretend that we have this.
Oh, please don't worry.
So my calendar's fine for.
Well, yeah. We weren't open.
Okay.
So, not a
My
problem.
apologies.
Oh,
God,
no,
I hate
don't
when
worry.
it happens. It doesn't happen very often. And I hate when it happens in front of these people, this many people on occasion like this. So sorry.
No, not a problem.
Good. I'm looking very smooth then.
Yeah,
Little
don't
breath
worry.
after
Yeah,
running
well,
4
let's
floors.
wait like 2 minutes.
Got it.
Let everyone get settled down, and then I think
Got
we
it.
could get started.
My daughter's here to take your daughter to
Oh,
work
really?
day. So,
funny.
and so she's like, now you see Daddy panic. She wants to race down. Anyway, I'm trying to see. Yeah, she's here. I'm trying to see where she went.
Also, we have a seat for you saved right here where Professor Saxon is.
Great. Okay.
Yeah,
So
and
I
it's
may.
here.
Can you? Oh, there she is at the back. She's the one that looks a little younger.
Yeah.
It looks like
Well, I met her at your house, so.
Oh yeah. That's right. That's right. It's Kate. Kate. Kate, you know Lily? Hi, I'm Ed. Hi, Johnny. Johnny, how are you? My daughter Kate. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry, Lily's not that.
Really easy to pick up that. Who doesn't say that?
Nice to see you again.
Sorry, you're both. You're Untitled Chapter.
Yeah, Chapter is Chapter. All the top things are.
Okay, good. So I'm okay. And I have a friend named Julie Rosenthal that I think I raised from you.
I don't think so. We can her. Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, check that out. It's
Okay, so.
Hey, so are you, maybe can I sit with Kate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sit wherever you want.
Why don't you go sit down by that
Yeah, I'm just going to take a swig of water, and then we can get started whenever.
down there beside the first row. There's 2 empty seats. Want me to walk beside you? Welcome, everybody. My name is Edward Iacobucci, and it's my honor to be a part of this occasion and to welcome you all to the Faculty of Law, University of Toronto, for this special and sadly timely event. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Remembering the Holocaust is a responsibility that humanity will bear forever. It seems especially important today. While anti-Semitism is a scourge that has sadly long existed, these are troubling times. Hate-motivated massacres of Jewish people, like that in Pittsburgh recently, are awful and gut-wrenching, but the way anti-Semitism has become almost normalized in public discourse is also awful and gut-wrenching. Whether it is the President of the United States describing neo-Nazis as decent people, or whether it is a political commentator describing George Soros in thinly veiled anti-Semitic terms. Our responsibility to remember the Holocaust is as strong as ever. So I congratulate our students, Samantha Rosenthal and Lily Chapnick Rosenthal, for putting together this evening's proceedings, and I will turn the stage over to them. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Samantha Rosenthal, and I am the co-president of the Jewish Law Students Association at the University of Toronto, along with my colleague, Lily Chapnick-Rosenthal. It is our pleasure to welcome you to the first ever official Holocaust Education Week event at the law school, Lessons from the Holocaust. November 9th marked 80 years since Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, a moment in time that many consider the beginning of the Nazis' final solution to annihilate the Jewish people. Until Kristallnacht, the Nazi program had been primarily aimed at humiliating, segregating, and exploiting Jews. German Jews were quickly dismissed from civil service and from teaching posts. They were forbidden from marrying Gentiles and risked death for extramarital relations. They were banned from using public benches and swimming pools. They were expelled from Germany's universities and cultural institutions. Their businesses were boycotted. They were punitively taxed. They were denied health insurance and other social benefits, and they lost their licenses to practice medicine and law. Yet until November 1938, though many Jews were the victims of anti-Semitic violence, and some were even killed, the systematic extermination of Jews seemed unthinkable. Kristallnacht marked the transition from discrimination to genocide. In response to the assassination of a German diplomat by a Polish Jew whose family was stripped of their belongings and rendered stateless by Nazi policies, the Nazi leadership ordered paramilitary groups and civilians to storm the streets of Germany, attacking Jewish institutions and citizens. German authorities stood idly by as angry mobs torched all of Germany's major synagogues, destroyed Jewish homes, vandalized Jewish schools, and looted Jewish shops. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were reported as having been demolished. At least 100 Jews were killed, according to official estimates, though recent scholarship puts the number much higher. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and deported to Nazi concentration camps. Over the course of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were brutally murdered. Just to put that into context for you, more than 1/3 of Jews were wiped off the face of this earth simply because they were Jewish. The global population of Jews has not yet rebounded or returned to its pre-Holocaust numbers. 80 years after Kristallnacht, Holocaust education is more important than ever. 80 years is around the average lifespan of a person, enough time for memories of the Holocaust to fade. But the truth is that anti-Semitism has never really gone away, and it still remains a serious threat to this day. Just weeks ago, Jewish communities around the world were rocked by the horrific massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which claimed the lives of 11 innocent people. Perhaps a little closer to home, on Sunday, 4 Jewish boys were assaulted by a swarm of around 20 teenagers who yelled racial slurs at them in an anti-Semitic hate crime here in Toronto. According to the Toronto Police Service and B'nai B'rith Canada, the Jewish community is the group most frequently targeted by hate crimes. Even though Jews make up less than 1% of the population of the city, Jews experienced 29% of hate crimes recorded in Toronto in 2017. Here today, we must face the reality that these incidents did not occur in a vacuum. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in Canada and around the globe. We cannot deny it. In fact, the Anti-Defamation League reports that anti-Semitic hate crimes went up by 57% in the US in 2017. When we witness Jews fleeing major European cities because they are no longer safe, when Jewish centers and places of worship are targeted from Israel to Pittsburgh, when swastikas appear on college campuses and Jewish students are intimidated by BDS activists, when we see all that and more, we cannot remain silent. For Canadians especially, we must understand that anti-Semitism is an assault on our diversity. It is an assault on the very notion that people of different backgrounds and beliefs can coexist peacefully and flourish in our cultural mosaic. An attack on one minority group is an attack on all groups. Though we may never be able to completely erase anti-Semitism or other forms of hatred from the minds of every individual, we all have a shared responsibility to ensure that those who promote prejudice and violence against any group remain on the fringes of society. By being here today, you are taking it upon yourselves to bear witness to the horrors of the Holocaust and to speak out against injustice to ensure that never again becomes a reality. Finally, I would like to end off with some thank yous. Thank you to our partners, the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and the Hart House Good Ideas Fund for supporting us in putting together this event. Thank you to our speakers for being with us today and for preparing insightful and impactful speeches that are sure to inspire all of us. And thank you to Dean Iacobucci, Sarah Marney, and Assistant Dean Alexis Archbold for giving us the platform to host such an event. Your continued support has meant the world to us. Thank you to Professor Dawood for making Holocaust education a priority and for helping us shape the programming of this event. And last but not least, thank you to our responsible and dedicated exec for working throughout this semester to ensure the success of this event. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, for your powerful words. My name is Lily Chapnick-Rosenthal, and I am the other co-president of the Jewish Law Students Association here at University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. Thank you all for coming to this important and timely event, and thank you to all the people Samantha mentioned for making this day possible. It is my pleasure to introduce Joshua Hacker. Josh Hacker is the Program and Development Officer for the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem, where he is responsible for managing all of the education programs and developing new programs to educate the next generation of Canadian youth about the Holocaust. For over 15 years, Josh has been working in nonprofit organizations, developing leadership and educational programs through his work in Holocaust education. Josh holds a master's degree in Jewish communal leadership and an MBA from Brandeis University. Please welcome to the stage Joshua Hacker.
Thank you, Lily. Dean Iacobucci, faculty, students, and guests, I'm honored to be part of today's program. The Canadian Society for Yad Vashem has the honor and privilege to help facilitate this program today and help share the story of a Holocaust survivor who was able to overcome tremendous odds to live through World War II and have the courage and determination to continue to tell her story and to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are not forgotten. Since its establishment in 1986, the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem has been educating Canadians about the Holocaust through various educational and commemorative programs. Our vital educational programs focus on teaching future generations of Canadians about the Holocaust and thereby educating responsible citizens who will stand for democracy and universal human rights. In pursuing this goal, our programs include the National Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremony and Ambassadors of Change program held annually in Ottawa. We also award scholarships to selected Canadian educators through our Holocaust Scholarship Program so they can participate in an international seminar at Yad Vashem in Israel to learn how to teach about the Holocaust. Upon their return, they educate the next generation of Canadians about the Holocaust. Stories of Holocaust survivors stand as a unique educational tool to teach about the Holocaust. CSIV holds a collection of Holocaust survivor stories in written form and video testimonies and encourages Canadian educators to include these unique accounts in their educational programs. It is our responsibility to share with young Canadians the stories of Holocaust survivors as they demonstrate that ordinary people were able to survive these terrible times. Hetty Baum was born in 1928 in Aradia, Transylvania, and was an only child to Ignash, a master cabinet maker, and Elizabeth, a homemaker. In May of 1944, Hetty and her family were sent to the Aradia ghetto, and from there, she was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was then selected for forced work detail at an ammunition factory and shipped to Fallersleben, Germany in August 1944. Hetty was liberated by American forces in April 1945. Post-war, Hetty returned to Romania, where she was able to meet up with cousins and where she married her husband, Imre. They were able to escape to Prague, where an aid organization arranged for this group of Hungarian orphans to get visas to Canada. They arrived in Halifax, in Canada, in August 1948. Hetty has 2 children and 2 grandchildren. In July 2015, Hetty testified against Oscar Groening, who was charged as an accessory to murder, and specifically that Groening economically advanced Nazi Germany and aided the systemic killing of 300,000 Hungarian Jews who were deported to Auschwitz by 137 railway transports during the summer of 1944. Groening was found guilty of facilitating mass murder and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. Following a number of unsuccessful appeals against the prison sentence, Groening died on March 9, 2018, while hospitalized before he had begun his sentence. Today, Hetty will talk about her life growing up in Aradia before the war, her time in Auschwitz, and also discuss how she came to testify at the trial of Oscar Groening and what that experience was like for her. Please welcome Hetty Baum.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hetty Baum, and as you heard, I was born in 28, Romania, Aradia. I'm going to try to show you where it is. It's the northwest part of Romania, very, very close to the Hungarian border. At different times in past history, it changed hands back and forth between the Hungarians and the Romanians. In my great-grandparents' time, it was Hungary. And after World War I, it became Romania. In 1939, when the Second World War broke out, it became Hungary, part of Hungary again, unfortunately. Because unlike the Romanians, the Hungarians were much more eager to get rid of their Jewish citizens and managed in 3 months in 1944, towards the end of the war, summer, to get rid of about 500,000 of their Jewish citizens. The transports left constantly, daily, toward Auschwitz, and we know the result. They were decimated. To start in the beginning, Aradia is a city of 100,000, quite a lovely town with a beautiful center, a lovely river running through the middle of it called the Körös, that had a lovely beach with pools and possibility to swim in the river as well in the summers, which I enjoyed for many years, till 44 exactly. I was an only child. My father was a fine furniture maker, and my earliest memories is riding on his shoulder going home from visiting my grandma, and then the following day, my mother taking me to visit him in his shop, where he was making everything by hand. 7 or 8 people were in this shop, and sometimes it took them a year to finish an apartment full of furnitures. Can you imagine how wealthy you would have to be today to afford that? I have one little footstool that he made for my auntie. That is my prized possession, and I still have it in my apartment. I also am fortunate in having a lot of photographs of my family. My father, mother, and I, age 1, age 7, 8, a passport photo where my mom went to visit her sister in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, great-grandparents, a photo of a painting that came into my possessions through a cousin who discovered me on Yad Vashem list. She was a genealogist she is a genealogist living in California, and got in touch with me about 10 years ago. We didn't know we were actually first cousins. Our great-grandparents were brother and sister, and it was a revelation for her especially, who thought she had no family, to be introduced to 100 or so distant cousins, nieces, and nephews who lived in the US and Czechoslovakia. School was very strict, all girls, Jewish school, uniforms, pretty strict curriculum. There were no chit-chats in the class. Teachers demanded and got obedience. I have my class pictures, probably the only one from my class who has them, and they survived because before going to the ghetto, my mother left our photographs with her youngest sister, who married a non-Jew and therefore didn't have to share in the tragedy of my mother's and father's. She survived, and after my survival in 1945, I headed back to my hometown, found her and her husband waiting for me with open hearts, and they opened their homes, and I lived with them until 1947. That was still school pictures, a Hanukkah celebration. I'm the second from the right. We were supposed to represent the different colored candles on the Hanukkah candelabra. I was about 10, and I'm going to tell you about my birthday present. It was a little book, sort of like a diary, but it was called a memory book. You didn't write in them, but you took them to school where classmates, teachers wrote in them, and your parents and favored relatives. This is my auntie, Ilush, my mother's younger sister, and it was she who managed to save these things. On the upper right, you see a few lines, and it's signed by Apukad, which means your daddy. He wrote this, and it's the only thing I have of him. These are drawings of my classmates, some of them quite talented. My best friend, whose name was also Hedy, a terrific pianist with beautiful long fingers. And this was from Majot, who sat behind me in classes the last couple of years in high school. And on it says, the gate to happiness, and may it be always open for you. She also was murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Life was safe and good. I lived in a bubble manufactured by my parents and the school, not knowing that there was such a thing as anti-Semitism in the world. My life was between school and home, and going to piano classes and French classes, and spending a week or two with my grandparents in the summertime, grandmothers in summertime. I didn't know until 1944, March, when my mother sewed the yellow star on my coat. And I realized that I am segregated, I'm different, and I couldn't understand why. There were many, many laws coming into effect in the years in 1940s, as you've already heard or read about, all aimed at taking away the rights of a citizen, taking away later on as the rights of a human being. My father, as his brothers and sisters and many other friends, could not believe the rumors they heard about what's happening during the Second World War as Hitler advances through Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia. They could not believe that this could be true in 20th century and done by the most civilized nation in Europe. They just didn't believe it. It can't be true. My father fought in the First World War with the Hungarian army. He was wounded, taken as a prisoner of war to Russia for several years. And he was very, very proud of having served his country. He believed that the Hungarian government would never betray its Jewish citizens as the other countries did. So we chose to believe the propaganda we heard on the radio and in the newspapers about how, at the very worst possibility, we were going to be transported to the border of Romania, where we would be till the end of the war, working there, helping out, and then return to our homes. They, my parents and his generation, believed it because the alternative was unthinkable. As I said, I was growing up in a bubble. I had no idea what was going on. It was never discussed by my parents or relatives in front of us children. Even at 15, I was considered a child by my parents who shouldn't be made to worry and be afraid. So they even sent me out of the room when they wanted to discuss something about what was happening with the new laws aimed against the Jewish citizens. It was the same in school. Curriculum was tough. In grade 5 to the Romanian, we had to study French, German, Latin, and we did. But never, ever was there anything discussed about our present or our future, the anti-Semitism and the horrors that they were taking with them, the German Nazis, as they advanced from country to country. So I was as naive as a 3 years old, totally unaware of what was happening, and totally used to trusting my parents and teachers to making decisions and following them. So in March 1944, when the principal had us, every one of us from the school, meet in the assembly room and announce that this is the last day of school, the latest law was no more school for Jewish children, school closed up. And he expressed his sorrow and his hope that after the war we'll meet again and we'll continue. And that didn't happen. But we didn't know that. Very shortly after the school closing and having to wear the yellow star, came the next terrible order of having to leave our homes. On that last year, 44, we all had to go to the police with anything valuable we had in our possessions, whether there was a bank account, money, or jewelry, paintings, sculptures, anything whatsoever. We had to hand it in to the police. We were not entitled anymore to have anything valuable. The leaders of our community, our rabbis, they all spoke about don't rock the boat. Do what you're told. Everything will be all right. You'll see. We have to abide what the law demands of us. So we did. We didn't rock the boat. We went into the trains, into the cattle cars, jammed in there, 80, 90 people, standing room only, like sardines in a can. And when the doors were shut, we found ourselves in a dark, standing pressed against each other, with a tiny little window with barbed wire for fresh air, and 2 pails given to us at the last moment, one filled with water and the other was supposed to take care of our bodily needs. There was absolutely no privacy, no room even to put up a coat in a corner. And the whole cattle car was mostly filled with very young and very old, mostly females, because in 1943-44, one of the laws against the Jews was to have every adult male leave his family and go into compulsory work camps and go with the Hungarian army or wherever they were ordered to go, cleaning up after air raids, doing all the heaviest, dirtiest work that the army had for them. Some were lucky and stayed in the country. Thousands were taken away beyond the borders, where the cold winters and not having proper clothing, the tremendous starvation and bad ill treatment caused them to die by the tens of thousands. My father was not to go. He was in an accident in 1939, was incapacitated, and not good enough for hard work. So he was allowed to stay with us. He managed his shop, but when the time came and we were in a cattle car together, I'm trying to remember desperately some last words from my mom and dad, and there is none. All I remember is the darkness, the fear, the stench, and the cries of babies who were hungry, children, old people who were sick. 3 days and 3 nights was this traveling towards the unknown. And even when we arrived and the doors were flung open, I had no idea where we were. I don't think anyone did. We were ordered by Nazi soldiers standing there with rifles and barking dogs held back on leashes, and pajamas-clad people running around, helping us down from the cars, telling us to hurry up, to hurry up. I tried to make some sense of where I am. I could not. I looked around. Within moments of getting off the cattle car, the men were ordered to the left. Before I could even say goodbye, my father was gone with the other man and young boys, and I never saw him again. Those next few moments changed my life completely. As I was trying to make sense of these barracks that extended as far as I could see, left and right, surrounded by high barbed wire fences, which later I found out were electrified. And nothing in my mind ever prepared me to know what this is, what this could be. I didn't know we arrived to hell, called Auschwitz-Birkenau. In another moment, all the women were ordered to form rows of 5 and march under the big sign that said, Arbeit macht frei, work will liberate you. It's ironic, even at that last moment in Auschwitz-Birkenau, they lied to us. And we went. I looked around for my mom and realized in a panic that she was already several rows ahead of me, and I started running as fast as I could to catch up to her. I never made it because a Nazi soldier stopped me, a rifle in front of me, and said, "No," and pointed to the right where there was a group of young women around my age to go there. I said, no, I have to go. My mom is there. I want to be with her. And he said again, no, the rifle didn't move. Go to the right. Then I cried after my mom, and she heard me. And she turned, and she looked at me. And I looked at her, and I don't know how long. But I'll never forget it. I don't know what I expected. But she just turned around and kept on walking away out of my life. I never saw her again. We were ordered to proceed into one of the camps. And we were ordered to go into the first barrack on the right to be disinfected. Ordered as we entered to take our clothes off, shoes off, just leave it on the ground, we'll find it on the way out. We did so. And about 50, 60, 70 of us young women proceeded into the next room and had a shower. The room was bare, gray cement floor, walls, ceiling, nothing there except shower heads in the ceiling. And we had our shower and were ordered to go into the next room, naked, dripping wet. We followed orders, and in the next room, to our horror, we saw not only women, but strange men waiting for us. Can you imagine the humiliation? They proceeded to shave our heads and our body, and then ordered us to go by this long table that had all sorts of garments on them. As we passed the table, the person behind threw a garment at you, whether you were small or big, if it fitted or not, that was that for the rest of the time in captivity. I remember getting a navy blue and burgundy Scotch-plaid little cotton dress. I still see it. There were no undergarments, no panties, no slips, no bras, no socks. And I was given a shoe, a wooden-soled boot, actually. When we put them on, we were ordered to leave and find a place in the camp, in one of the barracks. We proceeded, and half a dozen of us, as we were going by a building that had a window, we stopped. All the barracks were without windows except this one. The sun was shining on it, and it was like a mirror, so we looked. And I looked, and I didn't see myself. I had to count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, to realize that that odd-looking, bald woman was me. We went on and found a place in one of the barracks. Most of them didn't even have bunk structures, just the beaten earth as outside. I found a spot that was empty, and that became my place for the next 3 months I spent in Auschwitz. The first morning when the whistle blew and the loud screaming came to get up and get out and ready for roll call, we formed rows of 5 in front of the barracks and became the usual morning and afternoon routine for us, standing 3 or 4 hours in rows of 5, waiting to be counted. At the end of the roll call, they delivered a barrel, which was supposed to be our food, our soup, and I waited anxiously as they ladled out the first bowl and gave it to the person on my right, with the order of take a few sips, then pass it on to the next, and then back and forth until it's gone. I didn't eat, no one did, for 3 days in those cattle cars, or drank, and I could hardly wait. And I watched this girl take a sip and then put down the bowl as she burst out crying, handed over to the next person, and I was wondering, what's going on? And when the bowl came to me, I was last on the left, and I took a sip. I understood. This was not a soup that you ever thought of as a soup. It had no meat, no potatoes, no carrots, no veggies in it. It was dirty brown. It had twigs in it and the sandy residue in my mouth, and it tasted awful. And that was our food, plus a piece of bread with a tiny piece of marmalade or jam or cheese. We were living on that. I don't think it was more than maybe 300 or 400 calories, if that. A lot of people couldn't eat it. My best friend told me that she can't swallow it. But I think I was in some kind of a shock. I told myself my mother is in a similar camp under similar circumstances. She is young enough and intelligent enough to survive. And now I have to think for myself in order to be reunited with her at the end of the war. And I thought, whatever, however bad that liquid called soup is, may have some nourishment in it, and if that's all there is, I must have it. So I held my nose, and I swallowed, I cried, and I swallowed every day as much as they gave me of that horrible liquid. We didn't have to work. At this point, 1944, summer, Auschwitz-Birkenau was like a holding space. We had selections during and after the roll calls where armed guards came and picked you and not you, but you and you, anywhere from 50 to 1,000 people, and marched them out of the camp, never to be seen again. We had no idea where they went or what happened to them. No one ever came back to tell us. This is how life went on in Auschwitz-Birkenau for me. I decided that having to sleep on the ground and having just the one dress, no chance to wash it, I have to try and keep as clean as I can. And before the roll calls, I went into the washroom barrack, took my dress and shoes off, and washed in cold water from head to toe every morning. Dried myself with my hands, put back my dress, and went back to be there for the roll call. One day, it was raining, and my spot became a puddle. The roof above me leaked, and when I needed to go to bed at night, it was a puddle. I knew if I lay down in that cold, wet, I will be sick, and that I can't do that. I went out trying to figure out a solution. There was no other place for me to go. And I found 3 little pieces of wood near the barrack, left over from the building of the wooden barracks that we were in. And I took those 3 pieces of wood, maybe 2-3 inches long and 1 inch thick. And when I went back to my spot to sleep, I put one under my knee and one under my hip and another under my shoulder, and I was lying like that. I was sleeping like that. It raised me about 1/4 inch above the puddle. One summer day, the selection again, and I was chosen to go with 500 others. Shipped out and taken to a place in Germany. The trip may have been 1 or 2 days, I don't remember exactly. But I had the good fortune to be together with 2 cousins and an auntie of mine. We were selected at the same time. When we arrived to Fallersleben, now it's called Wolfsburg, a small town with a big Volkswagen factory in the outskirts, we were shown our place to live for the next 8 months. The whole street was bombed down by the Allies the previous few days, but the dormitory in the basement that was prepared for us was intact and waiting for us. It was our good fortune because it was built not for Jews, but for guest workers from Greece, Italy, Spain, and it was a place that was warm and decent enough to be able to survive the war in. It had tile floors, it had bunk beds. 2 of us had to share a single bunk bed, but it had a thin mattress and a blanket. There was a huge shower room with hot water in them, and that was a lifesaver. We did 12-hour shifts in a cold factory every day for 6 days a week. And when we came home, no matter how hungry we were, we didn't go to get the soup that was waiting for us. We rushed into the hot showers to clean us ourselves and warm ourselves. We stole little pieces of soda from the factory that they had there to take the rust off metals that they used. And we used this soda to wash ourselves, to shampoo our growing hair, and we learned to be very quick about it, very, very quick. If you kept it even more than a second or 2 in your hand, it burned a hole in your skin. But we used it, we were clean, and when Sunday came and we had a day off, we washed our dresses and we hung it up to dry. Our dormitory was intact except for the ceiling that had only construction beams and wires. And I hung one night on my freshly washed dress on one of the wires when I went to sleep. And when I woke up next morning, half of my skirt was gone. It was eaten by rats that were walking around. We saw them, huge rats. And I had a problem to how to pull together my one and only garment so that I can go to work. We managed somehow to do that. There was not much heat in the factory. The guards were in their winter uniforms with winter coats on, and we, the workers, were in our little summer dresses with nothing under it. Still, the food was good enough to keep us alive. This, in Fallersleben, when they brought the soup, had little pieces of meat, potatoes and carrots, vegetables in it, and a bigger piece of bread, at least for the first 5-6 months. So we all survived. The work was difficult, constantly under supervision, surveillance by the guards. And all this time, we had no idea what was going on in the world. Months and months went by. Can you imagine today with all your computers and cell phones not knowing for 8-9 months if there is a world beyond those walls that we were in? And in February 1945, I had the good fortune to work across the table from a French political prisoner. They were treated better, they had access to news, and he at some point signaled me to look down. He threw a little folded piece of paper, and when the guard wasn't looking, I picked it up, hid it, and took it back with me to our dormitory, where I opened it and read it to all of us. It said, "The Allies are advancing. Keep your hopes up. It won't be too long now." Can you at all imagine what that meant? To hear that there was a world, that if we survive, maybe we'll be meeting our loved ones? I don't think if you win $100 million could compare to the joy these few lines meant to all 500 of us. We struggled along and managed to be alive in April 14, 1945, when the Allied liberated us. They took us eventually to a place near Bergen-Belsen, where we spent a few months under Americans who gave us good food and gave us a bed and a room to sleep, and gave us the choice of wait here, perhaps for years, until you get a visa, or take a train and go back to your hometown. Now, before I tell you that I went back to my hometown, let me tell you that all this time I was still hoping to meet my mother and father. No, not my father. My father was handicapped. I knew he couldn't make it. But yes, my mother. And it was the day of liberation that my cousin told me that the road I saw my mother go led straight to the poison gas chambers. All those young mothers with their children, all those grandmothers with babies in their arms, went on this road straight to the poison gas chambers and the crematoriums. I spent 3 months in Auschwitz without knowing it, kept on hoping, believing that there will be that I will be reunited with my mom. And all these months, I never asked and no one ever told me the truth, so I lived with constant hope until April 14, when I was liberated, the happiest and the saddest day of my life. That's when I found out what Auschwitz really was. I went back to my hometown, where my auntie waited for me and made my home there with her for the next 2 years. I studied English, gymnastics, dancing. I was hoping to be a gym teacher. That was my childhood dream. But in 1947, I got engaged and married to my husband, Imre Bohm, who lived in the same town, who was also a survivor, whose parents were also murdered. We married, and on his urging, we left the country illegally the same day. He foresaw that the communist takeover will be soon, and there was to be tyranny, no free country anymore. He said he doesn't want to live under tyranny. He has to leave. And we did, illegally, at night, cross the border, taking a chance to be shot, because in those days already there were no passports or visas given by the Romanian government. We managed to make our way a few months later, arriving to Bratislava to my auntie, who was also a survivor, and eventually joined a group of Hungarian orphans to come to Canada with, and arrived in 1948. We were brought straight to Toronto, and after a month of living in a safe house by the UJA and given half-day tutoring in English, we were on our own. The younger parts of our group who were under 16 were taken to homes and given a chance to go back to school. My husband and I decided to go on our own. We started working in a factory, rented a furnished room, and started our lives. We worked hard. Eventually, we started our own business, working even harder, prospered, never got rich, but we managed to live a decent life, give our children decent life and education. My daughter is a teacher, my son is a lawyer, and I also have 2 wonderful grandsons. We worked. I worked alongside my husband in the business and managed to cook, to learn to cook. I didn't know how to boil an egg when I left my home. And we never stopped being grateful for Canada, for allowing us to come. I taught my children from a youngest age to realize how fortunate they were, that the greatest gift I gave them was to be Canadian citizens, to be born here, and never, never to take it for granted. And that is usually the biggest part of my message when I talk to young people, students, which I took on about a dozen years ago, when I decided, with all the Holocaust denial rumors while I'm still here, and all the anti-Semitism growing in the world, all the anti-Israelism, that no matter how difficult I find it, I have to find my voice, I have to talk, I have to say and tell my story, and warn the young people and anyone who would listen to don't believe in not rocking the boat. Do rock the boat. The power of one, I tell my students, is tremendous. You can do things that you can't imagine you are capable of when you put your mind to it and decide on it. And you will have to do that if you want a better world for yourself and for your children. I tell them to realize how grateful they should be for having a home, having parents, having good friends, a good school, good teachers, and to tell their teachers how grateful they are, and their parents how much they love them, and to do so, and to remember never to take it for granted, all the advantages that life here means. In 2015, I was asked by a wonderful man, a German man called Thomas Walter, who phoned me from Germany, to become a witness on the trial of an Auschwitz-Birkenau guard who may or may not have been there when I arrived on the ramp. My wedding photo, my arrival to Canada in '48 with the group of orphans who became our family since we had no family. These are my two cousins. They are both dead now. They moved to Israel from Romania when the borders were opened. And this is our first trip in Canada to Niagara Falls. I am on the left with my husband. This is in 2010, the first time I decided to go back with a group of students to Auschwitz. My son came with me, which made it easier, but it was a hard decision. I never wanted to go back there. But just like speaking to the students, I decided it was something that had to be done, and if not those who survived, who else should go with them? I went back 3 times in 2010, 11, and 12 with the students, and a few times again. This is Gröning, as he may have been when I arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau on the left as a guard, and as he looked at the trial in 2015. I didn't have to recognize him. He admitted he wanted to talk about his time in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Several years before the trial, he gave an interview to the biggest German magazine about his years in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And again, during the trial, several days were spent on him talking about it. He said he is not guilty legally, but morally, yes. But he never said, "I'm sorry." He talked about how wonderful it was for him in Auschwitz, how it was the best time of his life, all the friends he made, all the food, all the vodka they had. He also told a story when he said he never did anything wrong, he never killed anyone. He told the story of a friend of his that stood there with him on a ramp, and when the survivors were taken away, heard a child's cry. A mother hid a baby amongst the rags in the car. And this friend of Gröning went in there, found the baby, took the baby by the foot and smashed his head against the car door. And he said that wasn't nice. The 2 trials resulted in 2 wonderful new laws. Tens of thousands of Nazis went scot-free because in the first years in Nuremberg and later, they demanded that there should be an eyewitness before you can commit someone for murder. But there were no eyewitnesses left. Eventually, they were all killed. So thousands of Nazis, thousands of murderers went free. New law was established because of Thomas Walter's work and this trial, that even though you didn't pull the trigger, you were a cog in a machinery, the machinery could not function without you, and you were guilty. And so Gröning was found guilty. Another law, a year later, at another guard's trial called Henning was established, just as important. It was not providing the necessities of life declared to be a crime. And certainly there was no doubt that necessities of life were not provided, neither for those who worked in the work groups, nor the ones sent from Auschwitz to all kinds of places. So thank you, Thomas. And thanks all those German judges who listened and who brought the verdict. It is something that I believe is my gift to those who can be here. I'm sorry I won't be able to talk too much more. Time ran out, as usually does, and I will be later on open for questions. Right now, I just want to say again, don't ever forget how privileged you are being a Canadian citizen living here. Thank you.
We cannot thank you enough, Hedy, for sharing your extraordinary story with us. We recognize that it must be so difficult to relive your story again and again for people who are listening, but we so appreciate that you've chosen to do so that we might bear witness to what happened to you. I actually had the pleasure of being on your bus during the 2011 March of the Living trip that you mentioned, which took us together to Poland and Israel to learn about both the Holocaust and the Jewish state today. Your strength and your generosity in sharing this experience with us has been inspiring me for years, and I know that everyone in this room feels the same way. It is now my pleasure to move on to the second part of the evening where we might apply these lessons. And I will therefore introduce the Honorable Professor Irwin Cotler. We are so honored to have him here today to share his unique experiences and insights in the field of politics, law, and social justice. His accomplishments are too many for me to truly do justice to them, but I shall attempt to do so. The Honorable Irwin Cotler is the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and longtime member of Parliament and an international human rights lawyer. A constitutional and comparative law scholar, Professor Cotler is the author of numerous publications and seminal legal articles, and has written upon and intervened in landmark Charter of Rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. As Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Irwin Cotler initiated the first ever comprehensive reform of the Supreme Court appointment process and helped make it the most gender representative Supreme Court in the world, appointed the first ever Indigenous and visible minority justice to the Ontario Court of Appeal, initiated the first ever law on human trafficking, crafted the Civil Marriage Act, the first ever legislation to grant marriage equality to gays and lesbians, issued Canada's first national justice initiative against racism and hate, quashed more wrongful convictions in a single year than any other prior minister, and made the pursuit of international justice a government priority. As international human rights lawyer, Professor Cotler has served as counsel to prisoners of conscience, including Andrei Sakharov and Natan Sharansky of the former Soviet Union, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, Jacobo Timmerman of Latin America, and Professor Saad Eddin Ibrahim of Egypt, and he was chair of the International Commission of Inquiry into the fate and whereabouts of Raoul Wallenberg. He was a member of the international legal team of Chinese Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Zibao, and more recently became international legal counsel to imprisoned Saudi blogger Raif Bawadi, Venezuelan political prisoner Leopoldo Lopez, and Shiite cleric Ayatollah Bourgerdi in Iran. He has been named an Officer of the Order of Canada, an Officer of the National Order of Quebec, and is the recipient also of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Professor Cotler now devotes much of his time to his role as the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, in which capacity he is speaking today. The Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights is a unique international consortium of parliamentarians, scholars, jurists, human rights defenders, NGOs, and students, united in the pursuit of justice, inspired by and anchored in Raoul Wallenberg's humanitarian legacy, how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. We are so honored that he has generously agreed to share his insights with us. Please welcome to the stage the Honorable Professor Irwin Cotler.
Thank you, Lily, for those really very kind words of introduction. Samantha, for your spirited opening words, which framed our discussion here today. To both of you and the Jewish Law Students Association for undertaking this important initiative during Holocaust Education Week, and to Dean Iacobucci and the faculty here for their leadership and support with respect to this initiative and related ones. And also to the Canadian Society of Yad Vashem, and Josh, who represents them here, for your enduring work all these years. And Hedy, if I may say so, if I may commend you for your incredible, painful, and compelling testimony here today, for your bearing witness of what it meant to travel into the unknown, bearing witness of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was the worst extermination camp of the 20th century, for which there are no graves there, and for somehow maintaining your humanity and more in the midst of all that inhumanity, and then being able to bear witness to the bringing of Nazi war criminals to justice, and to have us here in Canada be the beneficiary of your humanity. So thank you, Hedy, for that, and for being with us. And so I feel very moved and humbled to participate in the common cause which brings us together, the struggle against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism, against mass atrocity, against the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, genocide. And this as part of the larger struggle for the pursuit of justice and the combating of injustice in our time. As my late father of blessed memory would always teach me and caution me, as he would put it, that the pursuit of justice is equal to all the other commandments combined. And this, as he put it, must be that which you teach unto your children. But my mother, when she would hear my father saying these words, would say to me that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice will remain a theoretical abstraction. And that is why Hedy's testimony is so important, and message about the power of one, how each one of us has not only a role, but a responsibility in the combating of injustice as part of the pursuit of justice. And as it happens, we meet at an important, almost historic moment of remembrance and reminder, of bearing witness and of taking action. For we meet on the eve of the 70th anniversary of the Genocide Convention on December 9th, sometimes referred to as the Never Again Convention, but where tragically genocide has happened again and again. And on the eve of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sometimes spoken of as the Magna Carta of human rights, but which has been violated in every one of its particulars again and again, but reminding us of our individual and collective responsibility for the promotion and protection of human rights 70 years later and beyond. And so at this moment of remembrance and reminder, I would like to ask ourselves two questions. What is it that we have learned in these last 70 years? And no less important, what is it that we must do? As Kierkegaard and others put it, life must be lived forwards, but sometimes it can only best be understood backwards. And in sharing these lessons with you, I'm reminded of and even calling upon the learning, the conveyor, and the acting on these lessons by my friend, colleague, mentor, Professor Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Laureate, Holocaust survivor, referred to as the conscience of humanity, who was the exemplar in word and in deed of what the pursuit of justice and the combating of injustice is all about. And where some 2.5 years later, I will be calling upon his teachings, his actions in sharing his lessons and his messages for us. The first lesson, as Elie would always remind us, was the imperative of remembrance, le devoir de mémoire, the duty of remembrance, and the danger of forgetting, where forgetting, as he put it, was tantamount to killing the victims a second time, of the remembrance of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, and of our collective failure to prevent them. Of the Holocaust, as he would remind us again and again, as a war against the Jews in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were targeted victims. Of the victims as being defamed, demonized, dehumanized as prologue and justification for their mass murder. Of the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews as not being a matter of abstract statistics, but as we say at such moments of remembrance, that unto each person there is a name. Each person has an identity. Each person is a universe, as our sages teach us, and it cuts across all religions. That if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. But if you kill a single person, it is as if you have killed an entire universe. And so, in the words also of Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, of the importance of memory, of the struggle against forgetting as being also the struggle against tyranny. And that each of us, wherever we are, must always remember and recall and act upon the fact that we are each, wherever we are, the guarantors of each other's destiny. Which brings me to the second lesson, the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide. For the Holocaust, and the genocides that followed resulted not only from the industry and machinery of death, but from state-sanctioned teaching of contempt. Indeed, it is this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all begins. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it in a number of the hate speech-related cases and those recalling the horror of the Holocaust, as the Supreme Court put it, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. These, as the court put it, are the chilling facts of history. These, as the court put it, are the catastrophic effects of racism. And as it happened, the 21st century began on January 3rd, 2000, with the supreme leader of the Iranian regime, Ayatollah Khamenei. And I want to distinguish this Iranian regime from the Iranian people, who, as we meet, are themselves suffering under massive domestic repression. This past summer was the worst in living memory for the manner in which the leaders of all sectors of civil society in Iran were subject to harassment, intimidation, arrest, and imprisonment. But I'm speaking of the Ayatollah Khamenei, whose regime propounded, and he in person, on January 3rd, 2000, that the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict cannot happen without the annihilation of the Jewish people. He did not use the euphemism of the Zionist regime, without the annihilation of the Jewish people, unless this be thought of as a one-time state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide. It has been repeated again and again, and most recently, of late, when once again the Ayatollah Khamenei spoke of excising this malignant tumor, Israel, from the Middle East. But what the states of the international community appear to have forgotten is that this state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide is a crime in and of itself. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it in the Mugesera case, in dealing there with the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda, as the court put it, that the very incitement to genocide constituted the crime, whether or not acts of genocide followed. And that there's a responsibility on behalf of the states of the international community to prevent and to combat this state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. Yet as we meet, not one state in the international community, not Canada, not the United States, not any of the European countries, have undertaken their responsibility, their international legal responsibility. This is not a policy option. Have undertaken this international legal responsibility for the prevention and combating of this state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. Which brings me to a third lesson, one taught directly by Professor Elie Wiesel, and that is the danger, as he put it, the danger of silence in the face of evil. And let me quote from the words of Elie Wiesel himself, because his words are so powerful and so compelling that they would lose in any translation, and they should be shared in his own words. And I quote, and they come right out of his 1986 Nobel Peace Prize lecture. And I quote, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race or religion or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." And he added, as an instruction to all of us, individually and collectively, wherever we are, and I quote, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest against injustice." And again, the reminder of Hetty's words about the power of one. Which leads me to the fourth lesson, the danger of racism and anti-Semitism. Of anti-Semitism being, in the words of my late friend and colleague, perhaps the leading scholar of anti-Semitism in our time, Professor Robert Wistrich, who referred to it as the oldest and most enduring and most lethal of hatreds. And where in his book, Lethal Obsession, characterized this historic, enduring hatred, which, as Dean Iacobucci put it, has become normalized in our day, in our discourse, and in its action. From 1941 to the beginning of 1945, 1.3 million people were deported to the death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau, of which Hetty spoke. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it, as Elie Wiesel put it. Jews were murdered in Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die in Auschwitz. It remains the bloodied canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And I was pleased to be present last week in Parliament when Prime Minister Trudeau and the leaders of the other parties joined together in an apology for the turning away of the SS St. Louis, the Voyage of the Damned, where Canada joined Cuba and the US and other Latin American countries in not allowing any of the Jews to disembark, where they were returned to the inferno of Europe that engulfed them. And all this in 1939, 1 year after Kristallnacht, of which Samantha spoke so compellingly in her open words, which foreshadowed and took us down the road to the Holocaust. And 1 year after the Evian Conference, when, as was said prospectively and prophetically at the time, Europe was beginning to be divided into two sets of countries, the countries in which Jews could not live and the countries in which Jews could not enter. And as Prime Minister Trudeau put it, the apology was not only for the turning away of the St. Louis. The apology was for the fact that from 1933 until after the Second World War, none is too many, as Professors Abella and Chopra put it in the title of this book, became the metaphor and message for the turning away of Jews into Canada. And where, as they put it in their book, it was easier right after the Second World War, it was easier for a Nazi to get into Canada than it was for a Jew. Which brings me now to the fifth lesson, and that is, and one that underpins much of what I'm saying and sharing with you today. That is the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity, and as I said, the horror that we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide. What makes the Holocaust and the genocides that followed in Darfur, in Rwanda, what makes them so unspeakable is not only the horror of the genocides. That would be bad enough. What makes them so unspeakable is that these genocides were preventable. Nobody can say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Nobody can say in Rwanda, where from April 7th to the beginning of July 1994, close to 1 million ethnic Tutsis were murdered in Rwanda, 10,000 being murdered every single day. Nobody could say that we did not know. And with respect to Darfur, nobody could say that we did not know. We knew and we did not act. And that holds true also with respect to the greatest humanitarian catastrophe since the end of the Second World War. I'm referring to what has happened in Syria, where we are witnessing close to 600,000 that have been killed. 12.5 million people, more than half the population, that have been displaced. 6 million refugees. And while we are addressing, as we should, the consequences of what happened, we should never forget the causes of what happened that brought about that humanitarian catastrophe. The indifference and inaction of the international community that made it possible. You know, it began in March 2011 with a group of young people marching in the streets of Dara, south of Damascus, with olive branches in their hands saying, "Peace, peace, dignity, dignity." And they were gunned down by Assad and his forces. Another group of young people came to replace them, and they were disappeared and were gunned down. By the end of November 2011, some 7 months later, there were quote-unquote only 7,000 that had been killed. There were quote-unquote only 10,000 that had been displaced. And again, I don't like to use abstract statistics because they tend to numb us or sanitize the horror of the individual killings and disappearances. But there were many of us at the time who felt that this was a classic situation for the invocation and implementation of the responsibility to protect doctrine. The R2P doctrine, which had been unanimously adopted by the General Assembly and UN Security Council in 2005, which said that if in any country there are war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed, or God forbid, genocide, and if the government in that country is unable or unwilling to do anything about it, or worse, as in the case of Syria, is the author of that mass killing, of those war crimes and crimes against humanity, then there is an obligation on the part of the international community to intervene and protect the innocent civilians. That's what R2P was intended for. That's what R2P was all about. And those of us who called for R2P to be implemented were told, you know, if we intervene, this will lead to sectarian warfare in Syria. This will lead to civil war. This will lead to jihadists coming in. Well, everything we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we didn't intervene. The dangers of indifference and inaction. And I felt this tragedy, particularly personally, because from in the summers of 1975 through 1978, when I was then a law professor, I used to visit the Arab countries every summer. I would go to Egypt, to Syria, to Jordan, Palestinian territories, and I'd end up in Israel. And my friends would ask me, well, why are you going there every summer? Because as I said, as somebody who seeks to be involved in what hopefully would be an Israeli, Arab, Palestinian peace process, I want to understand not simply the foreign policy, but the culture, the psychology, and not just of Arab countries, that's too homogenous. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Palestinian territories, and then I end up in Israel. And I never forgot my experience in Syria, because this may sound very surprising to you today, but it was in that country that I felt sparks of political pluralism, but all of it being suppressed under the totalitarian yoke of Hafez al-Assad's father. And so when those young people were marching in Dara, I felt this was the opportunity to give expression to those yearnings to those yearnings for liberty and freedom as they marched saying, peace, peace, dignity, dignity, that I'd felt then, back then, in visiting those Arab countries, and they brutally suppressed. And what was true of Syria was also true of the Rohingya. The slow-moving genocide that is still acting itself out as we meet. And I have to tell you that 5 years ago, when I was vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, we held hearings about the Rohingya. And we tried then to sound the alarm about the impending ethnic cleansing that would take us down the road, God forbid, to genocide. And so we held a press conference, I won't ever forget that, a press conference to sound the alarm about the pain and plight of the Rohingya. And nobody came, not one journalist came. And afterwards I bumped into some of the journalists in the corridors of Parliament. I said, you know, we had a press conference today about, and they said, yeah, something about Ringi, Rangi, yeah, sorry, we couldn't come because we were looking into allegations of sexual impropriety by some of your colleagues in Parliament. I said to them, I always thought that you guys could walk and chew gum at the same time. And so the alarm was not heard, and the indifference and inaction took us down the road to the genocide which we are still experiencing with regard to the Rohingya. And this brings me to the sixth lesson, and that is the importance, and this is what Eddie has participated, the importance, the imperative of bringing war criminals to justice, of bringing these hostis humanis generis, these enemies of humankind, to justice. If the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century have been the age of atrocity, they've also been the ages of impunity. Few of the perpetrators have been brought to justice. And so, just as there must not be any sanctuary for racism, and in particular for any state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide, so must there not be any base or sanctuary for these hostis humani generis, these enemies of humankind. For when we do not bring those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity to justice, what we are doing is enabling and encouraging more war crimes and more war criminals. And so the responsibility, as always, to combat the cultures of impunity, to bring the war criminals to justice, to hold the human rights violators of our time accountable. And I want to commend you, Eddie, for your participation in the Groening trial to bring these war criminals to justice. And two important initiatives of late that are important in combating the cultures of criminality and corruption and the impunities that underpin it. I'm referring to the adoption by Canada and other countries of global justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, so that if in any country we have cultures of criminality and corruption and impunity underpinning it, be it in Russia or elsewhere, what we can at least ensure is that those countries will not bring their perpetrators to justice, and indeed not only do not bring them to justice, but as in the case of Russia and elsewhere, reward them for their criminality, then we at least could ensure that they will not be able to enter our country, that we will impose visa bans, that they will not be able to launder their assets here, that we will freeze those assets, that we will at least hold them accountable. And if more countries, as it is happening, adopt such global justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, we will be able to begin to combat more effectively these cultures of impunity. And a second example has to do with Venezuela. A little over a year ago, the Organization of American States appointed what are called a panel of independent legal experts, which included Justice Santiago Canton from Argentina, Justice Ventura of Costa Rica, and myself, to look into whether crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela. after some sustained involvement on our part, public hearings, investigations, hearings, as I mentioned, and gathering of evidence and the like, we determined last May that there was reasonable cause to believe that 7 major crimes against humanity have been committed and were being committed in Venezuela. Murder, torture, rape, and perhaps the worst of all, state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, of the weaponization of food and medicine, of dramatic rises thereby in infant and maternal mortality and the like. And what has pleased me is that Canada has joined with 5 Latin American nations and more recently with France for the first time to refer these crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court for prospective investigation and prosecution. This is the first time since the International Criminal Court was established 20 years ago that we have had a collective state referral, and I hope that this will combat the cultures of impunity here as well. Which brings me to the 7th lesson, what I would call the trahison d'éclair, the betrayal by the elites, and I'm going to move more quickly with these last lessons to a close. The Nazi genocide was caused not only, as the sociologist Robert Lifton put it, by the bureaucratization of genocide, by killings engineered and orchestrated by such like the desk murderer Adolf Eichmann, but by the elites, doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, educators, faith leaders, and the like. The Nazi genocide was a result of la trahison d'éclair, of the betrayal by the elites. And so it's our responsibility always to speak truth to power and to hold power accountable to truth. Which leads me to the 8th lesson, and that is the danger of the vulnerability of the powerless and the powerlessness of the vulnerable. Again, let us not forget it, as Henry Friedlander put it in his book on the origins of genocide, that the first group targeted for genocide were the Jewish disabled. And so what we must always remember as an abiding lesson for our time, that the test of a just society is how does it treat its most vulnerable amongst it? How does it treat its poor, its sick, its disabled, its immigrants, its refugees, its violated women, its battered children? How does it treat the most vulnerable amongst us? And this, therefore, has to be the importance of giving voice to the voiceless and empowering the powerless in our movements towards the pursuit of justice in our communities. Bringing me to the 9th lesson, the dangers of violence against women. We may not appreciate that in the Holocaust and in the genocides that followed, violence against women was not only a consequence of the horrors of the Holocaust and the genocide that follows, but often took place in pursuit of those mass killings and in pursuit of the genocide. And so we must always remember the dangers of violence against women, the need always to protect against it. Indeed, this is part of the larger commitment to women's rights as human rights, to the human dignity of women, to the struggle for equality for women in our time. And in that sense, I want to share with you and recall the important statements made by women's leaders 25 years ago, which bear recall and bear acting upon today. And I quote, that significant numbers of the world's population are routinely subject to rape, assault, torture, starvation, humiliation, mutilation, and even murder simply because they are women. And so this lesson, a lesson that grows out of the Holocaust, that grows out of the genocides that follows in Rwanda and Darfur, is a lesson that still needs to be learned and acted upon. Whether we speak about the horrific crimes against women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the horrific crimes against women in Syria, or the mass rape against women with regard to the Rohingya. The protection and promotion of women's rights, of equality rights, must be an integral part of the struggle for the pursuit of justice and combating of injustice in our time. And I come now to a very compelling lesson, and that is that of the protection of children, of the danger of mass atrocities against children, and here too, the responsibility to prevent and protect. If there is an atrocity that belies understanding, it is the willful exploitation, maiming, and killing of a child, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. The Nazi genocide was a genocide of millions of children, and 1.5 million children perished in the Holocaust of European Jews. But we have yet to learn from these horrors of history, let alone act upon it. I'm speaking not only of these horrors that found expression in the Holocaust, or in Rwanda, or in Darfur, or in Syria, or now with the Rohingya, but that millions of children the world over, as we meet, continue to be subjected to arbitrary detention, imprisonment, enslavement, torture, cruel and inhuman suffering and punishment, execution, and even recruitment as child soldiers to terrorize and kill other children. And so perhaps the most important human rights lesson that I've ever learned, and I've said it before and repeat it again, was taught to me by my daughter Gila, now 37 years of age, when she was 15 years of age, when she came to me one day and she said, "Daddy, if you want to know what the real test of human rights is, then always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is it good for children? Is what is happening good for children? That is the real test for human rights, Daddy." Which brings me to a lesson that underpins very much that which I've been speaking about today, the dangers of being bystanders, let alone enablers. The responsibility, therefore, of remembering not only the dangers of indifference and inaction, but the responsibility always to intervene and protect as best we can, and to remember and pay tribute to the rescuers, to those who proved what one person can do, how one person, with the compassion to care and the courage to act, can confront evil, prevail, and transform history, of which Raoul Wallenberg is metaphor and message. And let me just give you one example which brings it all into contemporary appreciation and dovetails with everything you heard from the witness testimony of Hetty Bohm today. From mid-May to the beginning of July, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to the death camps in Auschwitz. The worst, the most cruel, the most efficient killing field in all of the Holocaust. Nobody could say then, in May to July 1944 in the international community, that we did not know. The world knew, but it did not act. Raoul Wallenberg came to Budapest in mid-July 1944, sent there by the U.S. War Refugee Board. From mid-July 1944 to the end of July 1944, this one person, Raoul Wallenberg, mobilizing others together with him, saved the remnant of 100,000 Jews. So what the international community could not do in 6 weeks, when 440,000 were sent to the death camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, one person with his bravery and bravado and a mobilization of others to join with him, saved the remnant of 100,000 Jews. And so it's a testament to what one person can do. The message of Eddie of how one person can make a difference, which brings me to the 12th and the last important lesson, and that is the importance of freeing political prisoners. Elie Wiesel would always remind us of the importance of freeing political prisoners. And on Monday, here at the University of Toronto this week, we inaugurated the Nelson Mandela Lectureship in Human Rights, in remembrance and to pay tribute to Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in a South African prison, 16 years of which were in solitary confinement, to emerge to not only preside over the dismantling of apartheid, but to become the president of the first free, democratic, non-racial South Africa. A testament to what one person can do. But if you say, well, I can't be a Raoul Wallenberg, or I can't be a Nelson Mandela, each one of us has within themselves the power to make a difference. And as we meet, we have political prisoners languishing in different parts of the globe. Reference was made to Raif Badawi, the imprisoned Saudi blogger now in his 6th year of imprisonment in Saudi Arabia, for saying 6 years ago what the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia is saying now. Or Leopoldo Lopez, the leader of the democratic opposition in Venezuela. And I have to tell you the incredible, very quickly, witness testimony that we heard in our inquiry into crimes against humanity in Venezuela, where the judge who escaped from Venezuela, Renata Tovar, came before us and said, I was ordered to issue the arrest warrant for Leopoldo Lopez, a completely innocent man. Where Franklin Neves, the prosecutor in Venezuela, who also escaped from Venezuela, said, I was ordered to frame the trumped-up charges against Leopoldo Lopez. Where witnesses came before us to say that they were tortured to issue false confessions against Leopoldo Lopez. Here, another political prisoner on whose case and cause we need to mobilize. Or the Ayatollah Bourjedi in Iran, reference made to him, who endured 11 years of imprisonment in Iran for doing nothing other than advocating for religious minorities in Iran, such as the Baha'i, for doing nothing other than advocating for freedom of religion in Iran. And after he concluded his 11-year sentence, he was placed under house arrest, denied the necessary medical care that he needs as we meet, a form of passive execution. And so the defense of political prisoners should be a priority for us. And I would like to suggest to the University of Toronto, to law school students, something that we did when I was teaching at McGill, that you adopt one of these political prisoners, that you advance their case and cause, that you use the international legal remedies at our disposal, and hopefully in that kind of mobilization of shame against the human rights violator, in that kind of internationalization of advocacy, we can free the political prisoner. And I close with just one reference, and that is with regard to the Holocaust survivors themselves. Because you endured the worst of inhumanity, and somehow you found in your own humanity the courage to go on, to build a family, to come to Canada or elsewhere, and to enrich our country by your presence, by your humanity. And I'd like to read in closing an excerpt of a paragraph from a Never Again declaration that we adopted on the occasion of the March of the Living, to which reference was made 2.5 years ago, where we had a conference at Jagiellonian University in Poland on the eve of the March of the Living, and in the presence of justice ministers, Supreme Court judges, legal scholars, and in particular, Holocaust survivors and the young people who were there for the March of the Living, we adopted a Never Again declaration. And I want to close by reading an excerpt from that declaration to bring all of this together, which says, quote, "Together with the Holocaust survivors, we must remember and pledge that never again will we be indifferent to incitement and hate, that never again will we be silent in the face of evil, that never again will we indulge racism and anti-Semitism and hatred of any kind, that never again will we ignore the plight of the vulnerable, that never again will we be indifferent in the face of mass atrocity and the impunity that accompanies it, but we will speak up and we will act against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism, against mass atrocity, against injustice, against the crime whose name, as I said, we should even shudder to mention, genocide. This is what the meaning of remembrance is all about. This is what the meaning of the pursuit of justice and the combating of injustice is all about. And so may this gathering, brought together by the initiative of students and faculty here at the University of Toronto and those joined in partnering with it, may it be not only an act of remembrance, which it is, but let it be a remembrance to act, which it must be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cotler, for your relevant, insightful, touching, and just so highly relevant to this crowd words. We are so, so grateful that you took the time to come speak with us today. We're unfortunately out of time for official questions. However, we do have a certified kosher catered reception. If you go straight back to the old building and hang a left, that's where our reception will be, and follow us. And you'll have an opportunity then to ask some more informal questions of our speakers. Thank you so much to all of you for coming today. It was such an honor to put on this event for all of you. And thank you so much again to our speakers, and we hope to see you at the reception. Thank you.